It was a calm Saturday afternoon for Emily Parker, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows while she prepared snacks, keeping an eye on her 5-year-old son Lucas, running in the backyard chasing a butterfly, his light brown hair bouncing, and his green eyes so familiar they pierced her heart with memories she had buried. Lucas shouted that he was going to the playground with Tommy, and Emily reminded him to be careful, never knowing how quickly her day was about to change. 2 hours later, the doorbell rang urgently, and standing there was Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor, holding Lucas in her arms, his face streaked with tears and his shirt stained with blood from his sleeve. Emily's heart nearly stopped as she grabbed him, whispering that everything would be okay, and rushed him to the car. The drive to Riverdale General Hospital was a blur of traffic lights, whispered prayers, and the sound of Lucas whimpering in pain as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, promising him he would be fine though fear consumed her. Inside the hospital, the emergency room buzzed with tension under harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant, but Emily moved quickly through admissions, refusing to let go of Lucas as the nurse guided them to room 3. She lifted him onto the examination table and kissed his forehead, calling him her brave little hero, forcing a smile that he tried weakly to return. The curtain opened and everything stopped. Dr. Daniel Hayes stood in the doorway, tall in his white coat, streaks of gray in his dark hair, stethoscope around his neck, his piercing green eyes locking on hers. And in that instant, 6 years of silence and separation collapsed. Emily froze as emotions she had fought to bury surged back: love, betrayal, grief, longing, while Daniel's gaze shifted to the boy and confusion gave way to shock and finally recognition as he saw his own eyes staring back at him. "Emily," he said, his voice unsteady. "Dr. Hayes," she replied coldly, pulling Lucas closer to her side. Lucas looked between them with innocence and asked if his mother knew the doctor. Daniel knelt beside him, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke, gently, telling Lucas he had heard about the accident and asking if he could look at his arm. Lucas nodded, still gripping his mother's hand, and admitted it hurt. Daniel examined him with careful hands, reassuring him that it looked like only a sprain, that an X-ray would confirm, and that he would be fine soon. For the first time since the fall, Lucas smiled faintly and thanked him, calling him Dr. Hayes. The sound of his own last name from the boy's lips hit Daniel like a blow, his eyes lifting to meet Emily's, the truth written silently between them. When the nurse took Lucas for the X-ray, the room was left heavy with years of unspoken history. Daniel's voice was low and rough as he told her they needed to talk. Emily turned away, insisting not now and not here, but Daniel raked his hand through his hair, the same gesture she remembered, pressing her again, his voice breaking as he said, "That boy looks like you," Emily cut in, her voice trembling. "I know." The secret she had protected for 5 years had finally broken open, and nothing would ever be the same. Lucas returned from the X-ray room with the nurse, his small arm supported carefully in a sling, and for a moment, the sight of him distracted Daniel from the storm building inside. The boy looked at him with innocent trust and asked softly if his arm was going to be okay, and Daniel forced a gentle smile, kneeling to reassure him that everything would heal quickly as long as he rested. Lucas beamed proudly, declaring that he was responsible for his age because his mother always said so, and those words struck Daniel like a blade, because he realized how many nights Emily must have spent carrying every burden alone while he was nowhere to be found. When Lucas was given a lollipop and occupied by the nurse, Emily stood silently against the wall with her arms crossed, her expression guarded and full of strength, hardened by years of struggle. Daniel studied her, recognizing the woman he once loved, but also seeing how motherhood had shaped her into someone even stronger, someone who had endured without him. Finally, the nurse left them alone again, and the silence grew unbearable. Daniel stepped closer and said her name, his voice heavy with regret, telling her they needed to talk. Emily's eyes remained sharp as she reminded him that now wasn't the place, but he pressed, his voice cracking as he admitted the truth he could no longer deny, that the boy was his. Emily looked at him, her eyes glistening, and whispered what he already knew, that Lucas looked exactly like him. The words hit like thunder, sealing the truth neither of them could run from anymore. Daniel sat down heavily on the stool by the bed, his hands trembling as he admitted that he had missed years, 5 long years of first steps, first words, birthdays. Nights of laughter and nights of tears and guilt consumed him. He confessed he never knew, never even imagined she had tried to reach him, and he explained in a rush how his world had fallen apart back then with his mother's illness, his chaotic residency, and his own cowardice. He admitted he had shut everyone out, too afraid of commitment and too overwhelmed by life to face the future. Emily's voice was sharp as she cut him off, her pain spilling out after years of silence. She told him about the countless calls unanswered, the messages ignored, the desperate visits to his hospital and even to his mother's house when she was weak from chemotherapy, only to be told that he wanted no contact. She told him about the loneliness of carrying a child alone, about dropping out of school, about working multiple jobs to survive, about raising Lucas with nothing but her own strength. Her words landed like punches, and Daniel could not defend himself. All he could whisper was that he was sorry, that he never knew, that he would have been there if he had realized the truth. But Emily's eyes held the raw wound of abandonment as she reminded him that sorry could never erase the years lost, the birthdays missed, the moments stolen. Lucas returned then, his face bright with childish joy, as he held up the lollipop and swung his legs on the bed. He had no idea of the storm that had just torn through the room. Looking at him, Daniel felt something break inside. For the first time, he wasn't just a doctor, wasn't just a man haunted by mistakes. He was a father staring at the son he had unknowingly left behind. And he knew in that moment that nothing in his life could ever matter more than trying to earn a place in this boy's world. After leaving the hospital that night, Daniel could not get Lucas out of his mind. Every image of the boy replaying in endless loops, the familiar eyes, the smile that mirrored his own childhood photographs, the small voice that had called him Dr. Hayes but unknowingly spoken to his father. During surgeries, in the middle of appointments, even in moments of exhaustion between shifts, Daniel found himself haunted by the thought of all he had missed. He realized that 5 years had vanished, 5 years that could never return. Yet something inside him screamed that it wasn't too late to fight for what was left. He drove home with guilt clawing at him, remembering Emily's words, the pain in her voice as she described raising their child alone. The truth pressed down like a weight, but beneath the guilt, a fierce determination began to burn. For years he had convinced himself that he wasn't ready, that he couldn't handle responsibility, that running away was easier than facing love and commitment. Now there was no more denial. The boy existed. Lucas was real, flesh and blood, and Daniel could not escape the fact that he was his father. The next morning he found himself researching child development, parenting books, and even videos on how to talk to young children. Between surgeries, he scrolled through articles about what 5-year-olds needed, about the importance of presence, routine, and trust. He was a man who had always prepared meticulously for operations, but this was different. He wasn't studying to save a patient. He was trying to learn how to save the bond with his own son before it slipped away forever. Days later, he drove to Brookside Elementary, where Emily worked as an assistant. He didn't even have a plan, only a desperate need to see Lucas again. Standing across the street, he spotted the playground during recess, and his breath caught as he saw the boy running after a ball with his friends, the sling still on his arm, but his spirit undimmed. His energy was pure joy, and Daniel felt something he had never known before, a pride that filled him completely. "Quite a view, isn't it?" a familiar voice said, and Daniel turned to see Emily standing beside him, holding a coffee, her expression calm but guarded. She had seen him watching, and for a moment he felt like a teenager caught doing something wrong, but she didn't scold him. Instead, she looked at the playground, her gaze softening as Lucas laughed with his classmates. She told Daniel that Lucas had always been popular, naturally charismatic, sometimes overcompensating for the absence of a father by becoming the center of attention, and those words twisted in Daniel's chest like a knife. He admitted quietly that he wanted to know his son, not as a doctor, not as a stranger who came and went, but as someone truly present in his life. Emily's eyes hardened again, reminding him of the years she had carried alone. And she told him she couldn't risk Lucas's heart being broken the way hers had been. Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady despite the storm inside, and promised he would not disappear again. He begged her to give him the chance to prove it. At that moment, Lucas noticed them from the fence, his face lighting up with joy as he shouted across the playground, "Mommy, look, Dr. Hayes came to visit me at school." He ran to the edge, excitedly showing Daniel how he could still kick the ball with his uninjured arm tucked in the sling, his laughter echoing like music. The boy's happiness struck Emily in a way she could not ignore. Lucas had never warmed so quickly to any other man, but with Daniel it was different, as if something deep inside him recognized the truth his mind had not yet been told. Emily looked at Daniel then, torn between fear and hope. And in that moment, Daniel knew he had taken his first step, however small, toward being a father. The journey would not be easy, but for the first time in years he felt a purpose stronger than medicine, stronger than ambition. He was ready to fight for his son, and nothing would turn him back. From that day forward, Daniel made every effort to see Lucas again, at first under the careful watch of Emily, who allowed only small moments, but even those moments felt life-changing to him. He visited Emily's home with simple excuses to check on Lucas's arm, bringing small toys and books that matched the boy's love for dinosaurs, and each time Lucas's excitement grew brighter, as if the presence of this man filled a space he hadn't known was empty. Emily remained cautious, always standing close, watching every interaction with the protective eyes of a mother who had suffered too much disappointment. But she could not ignore the way her son's laughter came more easily when Daniel was near. Adam, Brookside Elementary. Daniel sometimes arrived during recess just to watch from the fence, and Lucas would always run to him with stories about school, drawings of Tyrannosaurus Rex, and endless questions that Daniel answered with patience and delight. He discovered how Lucas pronounced dinosaur names with perfect precision, how he built Lego towers with determination, how he had a boundless curiosity that reminded him so much of himself as a child. Every detail carved deeper into Daniel's heart the truth that this boy was his, not only by blood but by a bond waiting to be nurtured. Emily, though, could not forget the past. She saw the way Daniel looked at Lucas with awe, and she felt the ache of memories return, the years of nights spent alone, the endless hours of work, the sacrifices she had made just to keep her child safe. She reminded herself not to be fooled, not to let old wounds reopen. But when Lucas hugged Daniel for the first time, arms wrapped tightly around his neck as he whispered "thank you" for the dinosaur kit, her chest tightened with emotions she had buried for so long. One evening, Daniel was invited for dinner, a decision Emily made reluctantly after Lucas begged to show him his toy collection. He arrived nervous, carrying a dinosaur excavation kit and a book about fossils, gifts chosen with careful thought. Lucas greeted him with such joy that Emily had to look away, because for a moment it seemed as though the boy had found a piece of himself he never knew was missing. Dinner was simple, mac and cheese with sausage bits, Lucas's favorite, and Daniel sat at the table listening as the child animatedly explained everything he knew about paleontology. His laughter filled the small apartment, and Daniel realized that this modest home already felt more like family than any place he had been in years. After dinner, Lucas insisted on showing him every dinosaur toy he owned, carefully explaining which ones lived in the Jurassic period and which belonged to the Cretaceous. Daniel listened with fascination, not just because of the dinosaurs, but because every word, every smile, every movement made him fall deeper into a role he had once run away from. For the first time, he wasn't haunted only by guilt. He was filled with genuine joy. He wasn't there out of obligation, but out of love he hadn't even realized he was capable of. Emily watched them from the doorway, her heart torn between fear and hope, knowing that allowing Daniel back into their lives meant risking heartbreak again, but also knowing that Lucas was happier than she had ever seen him. Daniel caught her gaze then, silently promising that this time would be different, that he would not run, that he would fight for the family he had lost. and as Lucas curled up beside him with his stuffed triceratops, eyes heavy with sleep, Daniel felt something shift permanently inside him. He had found the piece of his life that had always been missing, and he knew that no matter how hard it became, he would never let go again. As Daniel became a steady presence in Lucas's world, his absence from another part of his life did not go unnoticed. Victoria Lane, the woman he had been seeing on and off for nearly 2 years, sensed the change immediately. For months she had assumed that eventually their relationship would settle into something serious, perhaps marriage, because Daniel was successful, respected, and admired, and she believed she was the one meant to stand beside him. But lately he had grown distant, arriving late to dinners, canceling dates with flimsy excuses, and most alarming of all, there was a light in his eyes again, a warmth she knew had nothing to do with her. Victoria was not a woman accustomed to being ignored. The daughter of a powerful hospital administrator, she had always moved through life with the expectation that people would bend to her will, and Daniel had been her greatest prize. She was not about to let anyone, especially some woman from his past, steal what she considered hers. One afternoon she decided to surprise him at his office, stepping into the doorway just as he was finishing a phone call. She froze when she heard the soft tone of his voice, so different from the clipped professionalism he usually used. He was laughing about dinosaurs, telling someone that velociraptors were not as big as movies made them seem, that they were closer to the size of a large turkey. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Who was he speaking to? And why was he promising to go to the Natural History Museum with you and your mom on Saturday? When Daniel noticed her, he quickly ended the call. Victoria plastered on her most charming smile and asked sweetly if she was interrupting. Daniel's guilty tone as he said her name only fueled her suspicion. She asked if everything was all right, commenting that he had seemed distracted lately, but he brushed it off as work stress. Still, she knew. The careful way he avoided her eyes told her the truth. Someone else had entered his world. That evening, using her connections, she began making discreet inquiries. It did not take long before she uncovered the name Lucas Parker, a 5-year-old boy recently treated at Riverdale General. Listed as the mother was Emily Parker. A quick search of social media showed Emily's profile filled with pictures of her son, a little boy with striking green eyes that looked far too familiar. Victoria stared at those images with a growing sense of dread. The resemblance was undeniable. Lucas wasn't just a random patient. He was Daniel's son. The discovery hit her harder than she expected. For hours she sat in her car outside Brookside Elementary, watching as Emily left the school holding her son's hand. To her shock, Daniel appeared, walking beside them, smiling, in a way Victoria hadn't seen in years. She watched Lucas run ahead, laughing, while Daniel bent down to adjust the child's backpack with tender care. And when the boy turned his head, the sun caught his face just right, and the resemblance to Daniel was undeniable. Victoria's chest burned with jealousy, but more than that, fear. She understood at once that Daniel wasn't just distracted by some passing fling. He had found something real, something permanent, a child, a family, and in that family there was no place for her. That night she sat in her pristine apartment staring into a glass of wine, her mind racing. Daniel had a son, and that meant Emily would always be in his life. If she wanted to keep him, she would have to act. She told herself she was protecting him from a manipulative woman using a child to trap him, but deep down it was nothing but her own desperation. And in that desperation she began to plan the cruel move that would soon put Emily and Lucas in danger, a move that would set into motion a storm none of them could escape. Victoria Lane could not accept the idea of losing Daniel. The thought of Emily Parker and her son standing where she believed she belonged drove her into a spiral of jealousy that consumed every thought. She convinced herself that Emily was nothing more than a manipulator who had trapped Daniel with a child. And she decided that if Daniel couldn't see it on his own, she would make him see. Using her position in the medical field and the influence of her powerful family, she set her plan into motion. She contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a respected social worker, spinning a carefully crafted story about a child she claimed to have observed being neglected. Victoria spoke with just the right amount of concern in her voice, sprinkling in enough medical terminology to sound credible. She gave Emily's full name, her address, and details that painted a picture of a mother overwhelmed and careless, of a child often left unsupervised, of a home unsafe for raising a boy. Dr. Chen listened with growing alarm, not realizing that every word was a lie born from jealousy. By the end of the conversation, a welfare check was scheduled, and Victoria hung up with a cold smile, convincing herself that she was saving Daniel from a disastrous mistake. 3 days later, a knock on Emily's apartment door shattered the fragile piece she had been holding together. When she opened it, 2 social workers stood with clipboards in hand, explaining that they had received a report of possible neglect. Emily's blood ran cold as they walked inside, looking through her modest but tidy apartment, inspecting Lucas's room, asking questions that sounded less like curiosity and more like accusations. Lucas sat quietly on the couch, clutching his stuffed dinosaur, confused by the strangers and his mother's shaken voice. Emily tried to defend herself, explaining how she worked at the school, how she spent every free moment with her son, how Lucas was healthy, loved, and cared for, but every word seemed to be twisted against her. The official scribbled notes, exchanged glances, and finally informed her that they would return with a court order if the concerns were not resolved immediately. The implication was clear: she could lose her son. As soon as the door closed, behind them Emily broke down, her body trembling as she clutched the papers they had left behind. Tears blurred her vision and fear suffocated her. She had survived years of hardship, but nothing compared to the threat of losing Lucas. In desperation, she picked up the phone and called the only person she could think of. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Daniel, I need you. They want to take Lucas." When Daniel arrived minutes later, he found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by forms and official letters, her eyes red and swollen. Lucas played quietly in his room, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding. Daniel skimmed the accusations, his hands shaking with anger. Words like malnourished, unsupervised, and unsafe environment leapt off the page, every one of them a lie. He looked around at the home he had already come to know, a clean, loving space filled with Lucas's drawings and toys, and fury boiled inside him. "Emily, this isn't real. This is someone's fabrication," he said firmly. She nodded helplessly, whispering that she had no enemies, no one who would want to hurt her. No one in her simple life who would do this. Daniel froze then, realization dawning on him. Maybe it wasn't about her. Maybe it was about him. He thought of Victoria and the jealousy in her eyes the last time they spoke, and suddenly, everything clicked. He promised Emily that she was not alone, that he would use every connection he had, every resource to fight this. He vowed that no one would take Lucas away. And as he looked into her broken eyes, he silently swore that whoever had done this would pay for underestimating the strength of a father, determined to protect his son and the woman he had once abandoned, but could no longer let go of. Daniel refused to let fear take root. That same night he called every contact he trusted, lawyers, colleagues, and old friends, piecing together the truth behind the false accusations. He knew Emily was a devoted mother, and he had seen firsthand how Lucas thrived in her care, so whoever had dared to fabricate this report underestimated not only her strength but his determination. He reached out to his longtime friend Marcus, a family law attorney, and explained everything in rapid detail. Marcus listened carefully and finally told him that the accusations sounded manufactured, written with the kind of precision only someone familiar with the system could manage. That realization solidified Daniel's suspicion. Victoria had orchestrated this. The next day, Daniel sat beside Emily at her kitchen table, reviewing every document, every photo, and every report they could gather. He collected Lucas's medical records that showed regular checkups and excellent health, school reports praising his intelligence and behavior, and photographs of birthdays, holidays, and simple days filled with joy. Neighbors and teachers willingly offered to write testimonials, describing Emily as the most caring mother they knew. Piece by piece, Daniel built a wall of truth strong enough to crush the lies. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. He needed to expose the source. He arranged a meeting with Victoria under the pretense of wanting to talk, his tone calm and neutral, but his mind was sharp and ready. He recorded their conversation legally, pressing her with questions she tried to dodge, watching her slip as she revealed knowledge she should never have had. He cornered her with the fact that only someone with access to medical information could have fabricated such claims, and the color drained from her face. The trap was closing, and Daniel didn't let go. At the same time, he reached out to Dr. Chen, the social worker assigned to the case. He presented her with the documents, the records, and the truth, explaining that the original report had been made by someone with personal motives to harm Emily. Dr. Chen, professional but disturbed, agreed to re-examine the case. She saw that Lucas was healthy, loved, and thriving, and she began to realize she had been misled by a calculated scheme. While Lucas played innocently in his room, unaware of the storm raging around him, Daniel stood at Emily's side, his presence strong and unwavering. He promised her that no one would take her son, and when fear still flickered in her eyes, he held her gaze with a conviction she hadn't seen in him before. The man who had once abandoned her was gone. Before her stood a father ready to fight. With everything he had, the next step was confrontation, and Daniel was ready. He knew that to end this battle he would have to drag the truth into the open, no matter how ugly it became. Victoria had set the trap, but she had underestimated how dangerous a man could be when he was no longer running from love, but fighting for his family. The hearing with social services arrived faster than Emily could prepare herself for, but Daniel stood beside her like a shield, carrying folders of evidence, sworn statements from neighbors, and records that proved beyond question that Lucas was thriving. Emily sat tense, clutching her son's photo in her hands, her knuckles white as the officials entered the room. Daniel remained calm, his voice steady, as he laid out the truth piece by piece, presenting Lucas's medical reports, school achievements, and testimonials from teachers who described him as bright, well-mannered, and deeply loved. Every page built their case stronger, and for the first time Emily felt hope begin to rise. But the true blow came when Daniel introduced the recording. In clear detail, Victoria's voice filled the room, dripping with bitterness, as she admitted to having reported Emily, twisting her jealousy into lies. Gasps rippled through the officials, their expressions shifting from suspicion to anger at having been misled. Daniel's gaze never left Emily's face, silently promising her that justice was unfolding right there in front of her. Victoria was summoned to answer for her actions, and when confronted she tried desperately to spin another story, claiming she had been concerned for the child, pretending her intentions were pure, but the evidence crushed her. Dr. Chen herself, the social worker who had initially believed the lies, stood and acknowledged she had been deceived, admitting she saw, now that Emily was a devoted mother, and that Lucas was in no danger. The weight of the system shifted, and in that moment Emily was vindicated. The decision came swiftly. The case was dismissed, the accusations struck from record, and Emily was cleared completely. Tears welled in her eyes as relief poured through her body. She turned to Daniel, unable to speak, but her expression said everything. He had stood for her when the world threatened to take the only thing that mattered most, and he had proven that he would not abandon her again. Victoria's downfall was immediate. Word of her lies spread quickly, her professional credibility shattered, and the hospital board removed her from her position. For someone who had built her life on influence and reputation, the humiliation was unbearable. Daniel watched her storm out, her eyes burning with fury, but he felt no triumph, only the certainty that she would no longer hold power over Emily and Lucas. As they left the courthouse together, Emily held Lucas's small hand in one of hers while Daniel walked beside them. The afternoon sun warmed their faces, and though the fight had left her exhausted, Emily realized a shift had taken place. For years she had carried everything alone, but today she had not stood by herself. Today, Daniel had carried the weight with her, and for the first time in 5 years she allowed herself to believe that maybe he was here to stay. Life slowly returned to normal after the storm, but everything felt different now. With the accusations behind them, Emily no longer carried the constant fear of losing her son, and Daniel, freed from the shadow of Victoria's manipulation, began to settle into a new rhythm that revolved around Lucas. He visited regularly, sometimes helping with homework, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes simply sitting on the couch as Lucas climbed into his lap with a book about dinosaurs. Each small moment became a thread weaving them into something that resembled a family. Lucas thrived under the attention of a father he never knew he had. His confidence grew, his laughter rang louder, and his questions multiplied endlessly. He wanted to know everything about Daniel, from his favorite color to the first time he had ever held a scalpel, and Daniel answered each question with patience and pride. For the first time in his life, he realized that being a father was not about grand gestures, but about consistency, about showing up every day, about being the steady hand a child could rely on. Emily watched carefully at first, still guarded, still afraid of being hurt again. But as the days turned into weeks, she could not deny what she saw. Daniel was no longer the man who had walked away years ago. He was present, attentive, and determined. The walls around her heart began to crack, though she tried to hold them firm. One evening after dinner, when Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch between them, Emily turned to Daniel and whispered her gratitude. He looked at her, eyes filled with emotion, and told her he was the one who should be grateful because she had given him the greatest gift of all, even when he hadn't deserved it. That night, something shifted between them. The conversations grew, softer, the silences more comfortable, the looks longer and deeper. Emily found herself laughing at jokes she hadn't thought she remembered, catching glimpses of the man she had once loved but now layered with maturity and humility. Daniel, for his part, looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time all over again, admiring the strength she carried, the tenderness she gave to their son, and the quiet resilience that had kept her standing through years of loneliness. One weekend, he suggested taking Lucas to the Natural History Museum, and Emily agreed. They spent the day together, Lucas running ahead in awe of the dinosaur skeletons, his small hand tugging both of theirs until, without thinking, Daniel and Emily found themselves walking side by side, their fingers brushing and then intertwining. Neither pulled away. The simple gesture carried more weight than words. It was a sign that the past had not destroyed everything, that something new was beginning to grow. By the end of the day, Lucas was asleep in the back seat, clutching a toy T-Rex, and as Emily glanced at Daniel driving with quiet confidence, her heart swelled with something she had fought so long to suppress. She realized she no longer saw him as the man who had left, but as the man who had returned. And maybe, just maybe, this time he was here to stay. Weeks turned into months, and what began as cautious visits became a natural rhythm of life. Daniel was no longer just a guest in Lucas's world. He was a constant presence, arriving at school events, cheering at soccer practice, helping with bedtime stories, and sharing in the little victories that make childhood shine. Lucas adored him, introducing him to friends as his dad with a pride that made Daniel's chest ache. And for the first time he felt complete, no longer a man defined by his mistakes, but a father defined by love. Emily, though still careful at heart, could not ignore the way her son glowed with happiness. She saw how Daniel's devotion never wavered, how he showed up not with empty promises but with actions, how he placed Lucas at the center of his life and built everything else around him. Slowly, the fear inside her melted into trust, and trust grew into something warmer, something deeper. One evening after Lucas had fallen asleep, Daniel looked at her across the quiet living room and told her that he had spent years chasing ambition, building a career and hiding from the truth. But none of it had ever mattered because all along what he truly wanted was right here. A family, her and their son. His words broke through the last wall around her heart. Emily admitted that she had loved him once with everything she had, that she had hated him for leaving, that she had learned to survive without him, but that seeing him now she knew he was no longer the man who had walked away. She told him she could see the father he had become, the man who had fought for them, and in that moment she allowed herself to love him again. Daniel reached for her hand, and then for her heart, promising never to let go again. And when he kissed her, it was not the reckless passion of the past, but the steady, certain love of a man who had found his home. Emily kissed him back with tears in her eyes, knowing that this time there would be no goodbye. Lucas, still half asleep, wandered into the room clutching his dinosaur and saw them together. He climbed onto Daniel's lap, looked between them, and asked in his innocent voice if they could finally be a real family. Daniel and Emily exchanged a look filled with every emotion of the years they had lost and the hope of all the years to come, and together, they answered yes. For the first time in 5 years, Emily felt whole, Daniel felt redeemed, and Lucas felt complete. They were no longer broken pieces of a past gone wrong. They were a family reborn, and nothing would ever tear them apart again.